Surrender. The transmission echoed through the command deck, heavy with the metallic, guttural resonance of a species that had never known defeat. Outside the reinforced viewport, 1,000 hostile dreadnoughts blotted out the distant burning stars of the Ross 128 system. Admiral Trevor Coleman looked at the primary tactical display, watching the crimson icons swarm his battered fleet of 60 desperate ships. He didn't order evasive maneuvers. He didn't order a defensive screen. Instead, he leaned into the fleet-wide communications channel and whispered the impossible. Drop the shields. Deep space was rarely as silent as the poets claimed. Inside the command center of the United Nations Space Command flagship, the Archimedes, the air hummed with the vibration of failing life support filters and the low-frequency thrum of the primary fusion drives. The bridge smelled of stale coffee, oxidized copper, and the distinct acrid scent of cold sweat. For 4 grueling years, humanity had been losing the Orion War. The Vraxian hegemony, a coalition of militaristic apex predators from the galactic core, had pushed Earth's fleets from the outer colonies all the way back to the Orion's spur. The hegemony did not negotiate. They did not take prisoners. They snorts simply assimilated resources and glassed the planets of those who resisted. Admiral Trevor Coleman stood at the center of the tactical holotable, his hands clasped behind his back. He was a man from granite with deep lines etched into his face by years of sending young men and women to die in the cold void. His uniform, standard-issue navy blue, was immaculate despite the circumstances, a stark contrast to the grimy, fatigue-ridden faces of his bridge crew. Targeting telemetry is updating, Admiral. Commander Sinead Rogers announced, her voice tight. She was hunched over the main tactical console, a state-of-the-art interface designed by Lockheed Martin Space Systems just 3 months prior, though it already looked battered from constant use. I am counting 400 hegemony Vanguard cruisers, 80 heavy dreadnoughts, and God, at least 24 supercarriers dropping out of the slipstream. They have us boxed in against the gravity well of the gas giant. Coleman did not flinch. Confirm their exit vectors, Commander. Are they holding formation? They are fanning out into a standard crescent interdiction pattern. Rogers replied, her fingers flying across the haptic glass. They're cutting off our jump routes to Alpha Centauri. We're locked in. The Archimedes groaned as localized gravitational waves from the massive alien fleet washed over its titanium composite hull. Coleman's fleet, Coalition Task Force 7, consisted of 60 vessels. Most were retrofitted mining haulers, outdated destroyers, and a handful of General Dynamics-built heavy cruisers that had seen better days. They had gathered at Ross 128, a barren red dwarf system, to repair and resupply. It was supposed to be a safe zone, a blind spot in the Vraxian sensor network. Someone had been wrong. Incoming transmission. Lieutenant David Carter called out from the communications relay. Its tight beam originating from the lead Vraxian supercarrier. Audio and visual. Put it on the main viewer. Coleman ordered, his voice terrifyingly calm. The massive screen at the front of the bridge flickered, replacing the starry void with the visage of Commander Zyler of the Vraxian hegemony. Zyler was a hulking bipedal reptilian figure, clad in ceremonial armor that shimmered with microkinetic shielding. His eyes, devoid of pupils, were twin pools of liquid gold, staring with absolute, unwavering contempt. Human fleet element. Zyler's voice translated through the computer's linguistic matrix, rendering it into a flat, synthetic English that somehow made it sound even more menacing. Your logistical supply lines are severed. Your slip space drives are trapped within our gravity interdiction net. You possess 60 vessels of inferior metallurgical composition and primitive nuclear output. We bring the combined might of the First Hegemony Armada. Surrender your vessels. Power down your weapon systems. Submit to processing, or you will be reduced to atomic vapor. The bridge of the Archimedes fell deathly silent. The crew looked to Admiral Coleman. They knew what processing meant. It was the Vraxian term for enslavement, biological harvesting, and forced labor in the radiation-drenched lithium mines of the core worlds. "They've locked weapons, sir," Rogers whispered, her eyes glued to the Raytheon early warning sensors. "I'm reading massive thermal spikes in their plasma accelerators. They aren't going to wait long." Coleman stared at the alien commander's face on the screen. He thought of the billions of lives back on Earth, currently unaware that the final line of defense was about to be snuffed out in a forgotten red dwarf system. He thought of the secret, desperate project that had been finalized in the deep underground bunkers of DARPA, rushed onto the fleet just weeks before this deployment. "Tell them," Coleman said, his voice steady, "that we have received their message and cut the feed." The screen blinked back to the tactical map. The red sea of Vraxian ships was closing the distance, creeping into effective firing range. "Admiral?" Rogers asked, her hand hovering over the evasive action protocols. "Do we spool the slip drives? Try to punch a hole through their left flank?" The Vanguard and the Hyperion could ram their vanguard by the civilian ship's time to jump. "No, Commander," Coleman interrupted, turning away from the screen to face his crew. "We hold position." Rogers stared at him, bewildered. "Hold position? Sir, they are going to turn us into slag in less than 4 minutes." Coleman reached down to his personal console and keyed a direct encrypted channel to engineering. "Dr. Collins, are the Lockheed zero-point arrays primed?" A voice crackled over the earpiece, frantic and breathless. Aeneas Collins, the fleet's chief civilian physicist, was shouting over the roar of the ship's reactor. "Primed? Admiral, they're barely stable. The containment fields are fluctuating by 3%. If we activate them, there is a distinct possibility we atomize ourselves before the Vraxis even get a chance." "I didn't ask for a safety inspection, Doctor," Coleman said coldly. "I asked if they were primed." A heavy sigh echoed through the comms. "Yes, Admiral. Operation Glasshouse is armed. But you know the parameters. The arrays cannot fire through our own electromagnetic defensive grids. The interference will cause a catastrophic feedback loop. The shields have to be down." "Understood," Coleman said, cutting the connection. He looked back up at the bridge crew. Every eye was on him. These were seasoned veterans, men and women who had seen colony worlds burn. They trusted him with their lives, but what he was about to ask went against every instinct of survival drilled into them since the Naval Academy. Coleman took a deep breath, the stale air filling his lungs, and keyed the fleet-wide broadcast. "All vessels in Task Force 7. This is Admiral Coleman. We are not retreating. We are not surrendering. On my mark, you are to disengage all localized electromagnetic shielding. Reroute all auxiliary power to the glasshouse arrays. Drop the shields. Absolute pandemonium threatened to break out across the fleet's command network. Captains of the accompanying destroyers and cruisers flooded the encrypted channels, demanding confirmation, assuming the Admiral's transmission had been compromised by Raxus electronic warfare. "Admiral, this is Captain Miller on the Stargazer. Did you say drop shields? We'll be sitting ducks. This is the Dauntless. Please authenticate order. We have incoming targeting lasers painting our hulls." On the bridge of the Archimedes, Commander Rogers stood frozen, her hand suspended over her console. "Sir, without shields, a single stray micrometeorite at sublight speeds could breach our hull. A Raxus plasma volley will melt our armor plating in milliseconds." "I am aware of the physics, Commander Rogers," Coleman said, his voice a low commanding rumble that instantly quieted the murmurs on the bridge. "Execute the order. Authentication code Alpha Tango 907 Omega. Drop the fleet's shields." Rogers swallowed hard. Her training fought against her fingers, but her loyalty to Coleman won out. She entered the authentication codes. Across the command deck, the tactical officers followed suit. Outside, in the cold vacuum of space, the shimmering blue-white electromagnetic bubbles that enveloped the 60 human ships suddenly flickered and died. The hum of the shield generators spun down, leaving a terrifying silence in the lower decks. The human fleet sat entirely naked against the backdrop of the cosmos. Nothing but raw titanium and carbon plating standing between the crews and the annihilating heat of the Vraxian hegemony. Aboard the hegemony supercarrier Obsidian Blade, Commander Zyler stared at his sensor readouts in profound confusion. The Vraxian did not understand human psychology, but they understood warfare perfectly. In standard fleet engagements, dropping shields was a universal sign of unconditional surrender. It was a technological submission. "Sub-Commander," Zyler growled, his golden eyes narrowing. "Are their weapon systems powering down? Are they preparing their reactors for boarding protocols?" The sub-commander, a younger Vraxian with pale green scales, tapped frantically at his terminal. "Negative, High Commander. Their primary weapons are cold, but we are detecting a massive energy surge in their lower engineering decks. It is anomalous. It does not match standard human nuclear signatures, and their engines remain active. They are holding formation." Zyler chattered his mandibles in a sign of deep agitation. This was a trap. It had to be. But what could 60 unshielded inferior vessels possibly do against 400 fully armed warships? If the humans fired standard kinetic railguns, the Vraxian shields would deflect them effortlessly. If they used nuclear torpedoes, point defense lasers would detonate them halfway across the battlefield. "They mock us," Zyler concluded, his pride overriding his tactical caution. "They drop their shields as a final act of insolence, daring us to fire, perhaps hoping to detonate their own reactors and catch our vanguard in the blast radius. Do not give them the satisfaction of a glorious death." Zyler raised his armored hand. "Order the vanguard cruisers. Fire a single synchronized volley of low-yield plasma torpedoes. Burn away their outer hulls. Let them suffocate in the vacuum before we salvage their technology." Back on the Archimedes, the klaxons finally began to wail. Thermal spikes detected, Rogers yelled, her voice cracking as the adrenaline hit her system. Vanguard ships are firing. Plasma torpedoes, low yield, but it won't matter without shields. Time to impact, 40 seconds. Dr. Coleman said into the comms, his eyes locked on the approaching red dots on the tactical display. I need the glasshouse arrays online now. Deep in the bowels of the ship, Aeneas Collins was violently typing on a heavily modified Boeing aerospace terminal. The null-point projectors were not weapons in the traditional sense. They were theoretical physics engines conceptualized by DARPA and rushed into production. They didn't fire projectiles. They manipulated the localized fabric of space-time using exotic dark matter siphoned from dying stars. Spinning up the arrays, Collins yelled, the sound of grinding metal echoing behind him. Without our shields to cause electromagnetic friction, the projectors are creating the localized singularities. But, Admiral, the math on this is purely theoretical. We don't know how the projection fields will react to incoming plasma. We're about to find out, Coleman muttered. 30 seconds to impact. The bridge was suffocatingly tense. The crew watched the tactical feed as hundreds of glowing superheated spheres of Raxus plasma hurtled across the dark expanse of space, aimed directly at the unshielded human fleet. 20 seconds. Rogers' knuckles were white as she gripped the edges of her console. Hold the line, Coleman ordered over the fleet channel. Do not break formation. Trust the engineers. 10 seconds. Through the reinforced glass of the viewport, the incoming plasma torpedoes became visible to the naked eye. A terrifying wave of artificial suns racing to incinerate them. The sheer heat radiating from the approaching volley began to trigger the ship's external temperature alarms. 5 seconds. 432 Collins engaged null point, Coleman roared. In absolute silence, the universe seemed to fracture. Along the hulls of the 60 human vessels, the experimental Lockheed Martin arrays activated. There was no flash of light, no concussive shockwave. Instead, the space immediately surrounding the human fleet simply distorted. It looked as though the ships had been suddenly submerged in deep water. The starlight behind them warping and bending in impossible, sickening angles. The null-point fields did not create a solid barrier like traditional electromagnetic shields. Instead, they generated localized pockets of compressed space-time, essentially folding the vacuum around the ships into a series of invisible, infinitely dense gravitational funnels. The Vraxis plasma torpedoes struck the distorted space. They didn't explode. They didn't splash against a barrier. They simply vanished. On the bridge of the Archimedes, the crew stared in stunned disbelief. The tactical display showed the Vraxis munitions hitting the outer perimeter of the human fleet and instantly dropping off the sensors. Report. Coleman barked, breaking the paralyzed silence. Impacts registered, sir. Rogers stammered, pulling up the telemetry data. But no hull damage. External temperatures are nominal. The plasma it didn't dissipate. The null-point field swallowed it. Sir, the arrays are capturing the incoming kinetic and thermal energy. They are holding it within the singularity pockets. In the engine room, Collins was looking at a screen that was flashing with catastrophic warning lights. Admiral, the fields are holding, but they are absorbing the energy. We are essentially trapping their firepower in a suspended gravitational state right outside our hulls. We can't hold this much energy for long. The containment matrices are going to shatter. We don't need to hold it, Aeneas, Coleman said, a grim, predatory smile touching the corners of his mouth for the first time in 4 years. We just needed to borrow it. Rogers, calculate the inversion vectors. Link the fleet's targeting computers to the glasshouse arrays. On the Vraxian flagship, Commander Zyler watched the impossible happen. His tactical officers were screaming in their native tongues, their consoles displaying errors they had never seen. The human ships had not been destroyed. They hadn't even been scorched. The plasma volley had simply ceased to exist upon contacting the human formation. What trickery is this? Zyler demanded, slamming a fist onto his command console. Scan them. Where did the plasma go? Hi, Commander. We are detecting massive energy spikes from the human vessels, the sub-commander cried out. Their power output is exceeding theoretical limits. They are weaponizing our own volley. Admiral, inversion vectors are locked, Rogers reported on the Archimedes. The arrays are ready to reverse the singularity polarity. We are aiming their trapped plasma back at them, combined with our own dark matter acceleration. Fire, Coleman commanded. The space around the human fleet violently snapped back into standard geometry. The null-point projectors violently reversed their gravitational funnels, acting like a cosmic slingshot. The hundreds of Vrax's plasma torpedoes, previously suspended in the localized singularities, were violently expelled outward. But they were no longer just plasma torpedoes. Accelerated by the collapsing gravitational fields, the projectiles had been compressed into hyperdense beams of superheated exotic matter. They tore across the void at a fraction of the speed of light, leaving blinding streaks of purple and white radiation in their wake. The Vrax's vanguard didn't have time to register the counterattack, let alone evade. The hyper-accelerated beams struck the Vrax's energy shields. The hegemony's shields were designed to disperse standard kinetic impacts and thermal blooms. They were not designed to withstand gravitationally compressed exotic matter traveling at relativistic speeds. The shield shattered like cheap glass. The front line of 80 Vrax's cruisers was instantly eviscerated. The beams punched straight through their heavy armor, detonating their internal plasma reactors, and exiting out the other side to strike the ships behind them. Silent, brilliant spheres of expanding fire blossomed across the dark canvas of space, as nearly a quarter of the alien armada was annihilated in a single devastating heartbeat. Cheers erupted across the bridge of the Archimedes, but Coleman's face remained stone. Do not celebrate yet. We just kicked the hornet's nest. Status of the fleet? Energy reserves on the glasshouse arrays are depleted, sir, Rogers said, her fingers dancing across the console to reroute power. They need 3 minutes to cool down before they can generate another null point field. We are completely unshielded and out of tricks. Admiral, the communications officer yelled, we have a malfunction on the Stargazer. Captain Miller is reporting that their Lockheed array suffered a containment breach during the inversion sequence. Their primary power manifold is fused. They are dead in the water. Coleman pulled up the visual of the Stargazer on the tactical map. The heavy cruiser was drifting slightly out of formation, trailing a thin mist of frozen oxygen and coolant. Before Coleman could issue an order, the Vraxis retaliated. Furious, humiliated, and realizing the human fleet was vulnerable during its recharge cycle, Commander Ziller ordered the remaining heavy dreadnoughts to fire their primary kinetic rail guns. Massive slugs of depleted uranium, accelerated by magnetic coils, streaked across the void. Without the glasshouse arrays or standard shields, the stargazer was defenseless. Snorts, greater than 2 kinetic slugs, slammed into its port side. The impact was brutally kinetic. The cruiser shuddered violently as the round sheared through the titanium hull, ripping through the crew decks and detonating deep within the ship's infrastructure. Secondary explosions rippled along the vessel's spine, and the ship broke completely in half, spilling debris, atmosphere, and human bodies into the uncaring vacuum. The bridge of the Archimedes fell silent again. The reality of the war crashed back upon them. The magic trick had worked, but they were still 60 ships against hundreds, and now they were bleeding. "Hold formation," Coleman said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "Do not break the line to assist the stargazer. Divert all remaining auxiliary power to the conventional railguns. If they want a knife fight while our projectors recharge, we will give them one." The surviving human ships, though terrified by the loss of the stargazer, locked their weapons onto the burning remnants of the Vraxian vanguard. The humans had shown the galaxy that they could bend the laws of physics to survive. Now they were going to show the Vraxians how humans fought when they were pushed into a corner. Space around Ross 128 became a graveyard of shattered metal and freezing vapor. Without their electromagnetic shields, the surviving 59 human vessels relied entirely on Northrop Grumman, ablative armor plating, and the sheer desperate willpower of their crews. Admiral Trevor Coleman watched the tactical hollow table as the distance between the two fleets rapidly closed. The Vraxian hegemony, reeling from the catastrophic loss of their vanguard, had abandoned Snorts, their elegant crescent formation. Commander Ziller was throwing his heavy dreadnoughts forward in a blind, furious charge, eager to crush the unshielded human ships beneath overwhelming numbers. Distance to hostile dreadnoughts is 80,000 kilometers and closing, Commander Sanad Rogers reported, her voice strained over the shuddering groan of the Archimedes hull. "They are launching autonomous strike craft, thousands of them, and we are painting multiple incoming kinetic signatures. They are trying to overwhelm our point defense networks. Link all BAE Systems automated defense turrets to the central AI mainframe," Coleman ordered, gripping the edge of the hollow table. "Prioritize incoming heavy munitions. Let the strike craft break upon our armor. All ships concentrate primary railgun fire on the lead Vraxian dreadnoughts. Do not spread your fire. Crack their shields one by one. Aye, Admiral." Targeting algorithms sensed. Across the human formation, massive magnetic coils spooled up with bone-rattling intensity. Along the dorsal and ventral spines of the human cruisers, heavy tungsten carbide rounds were accelerated to a fraction of the speed of light. The human fleet fired in unison. Unlike the silent, colorful lethality of plasma, the human kinetic strike was a brutal display of brute force physics. Dozens of hypervelocity slugs slammed into the forward energy shields of the lead Vraxian dreadnought. The alien shields flared violently, shifting from deep violet to a blinding furious white as they struggled to disperse the kinetic energy. For a brief moment, the shields held. Then 3 consecutive rounds from the Hyperion struck the exact same coordinate on the dreadnought's port bow. The shield generator overloaded, shattering the energy barrier. The subsequent railgun rounds through the Vraxis dreadnought's armored prow, ripping deep into its internal structure and detonating its forward munitions magazines. The massive alien warship buckled, venting atmospheric gases and debris before going entirely dark, drifting aimlessly into the gravity well of the nearby gas giant. "Target destroyed," Rogers called out, her hands flying across the terminal, shifting fire to the next dreadnought. "But Admiral, their strike craft are in range. We are taking heavy fire." Outside the reinforced viewport, the dark void was lit by a chaotic storm of tracer rounds and micro-missile detonations. The Vraxis strike craft, nimble and heavily armed, swarmed the lumbering human cruisers like angry hornets. Standard combat protocol dictated that capital ships rely on their energy shields to weather such localized attacks. Without them, the human vessels were taking raw kinetic impacts directly to their hulls. The Archimedes shuddered violently as a squadron of Vraxis fighters strafed its starboard engine nacelle. Sparks showered down onto the command deck from an overhead conduit, and the harsh red strobes of damage. Control alarms began to flash. Hull breach on decks 4 and 7. Lieutenant David Carter shouted from the damage control station. "Automated bulkheads are sealing, but we've lost a starboard sensor array. The BAE point defense cannons are overheating. They can't track the fighters fast enough. Keep those cannons firing until the barrels melt, Carter." Coleman barked, not taking his eyes off the tactical map. "Dr. Collins, status on the glasshouse arrays? I need those null-point fields back online." Down in the frantic, smoke-filled engineering bay, Aeneas Collins was wrestling with a primary coolant valve, his face smeared with grease and soot. "Admiral, the supercapacitors are only at 60%. We pulled too much ambient radiation during the first inversion. The Lockheed matrices are fighting us. If we trigger the singularity fields before they reach maximum capacity, the gravitational funnels will collapse inward. We'll crush our own ships into microscopic singularities." "I need a time, Doctor," Coleman said, his voice cold and unwavering despite the chaos erupting around him. 90 seconds, Collins yelled back, coughing violently as an electrical fire broke out on a nearby terminal. "Just give me 90 seconds and I'll give you the universe." "We don't have 90 seconds, Rogers interrupted, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. She pointed at the main screen. The Vraxis supercarriers, massive angular behemoths that dwarfed the heavy dreadnoughts, were moving into the fray. These were city-sized fortresses of war, armed with heavy plasma lances capable of boiling an ocean in minutes. They had remained on the periphery of the battlefield, anchoring the gravity interdiction net that trapped the human fleet. Now, infuriated by the stubborn resistance of the inferior species, Commander Zeiler was bringing his personal executioners into range. "Hi, Commander," the Vrax sub-commander hissed on the bridge of the Obsidian Blade. "The human vessels are sustaining catastrophic structural damage. Their armor is failing. They are venting atmosphere, but they do not retreat. They do not break formation." Ziller stared at the holographic projection of the battle. The humans were fighting with a savage, unyielding ferocity that defied all logic. They were bleeding, dying, and burning, yet their kinetic rail guns continued to fire with terrifying synchronization. They had already destroyed 12 heavy dreadnoughts and crippled dozens more. It was a humiliating loss of hegemony assets. "They are trapped animals," Ziller growled, his golden eyes narrowing with absolute hatred. "They know they cannot escape our interdiction field, so they seek only to inflict pain before they expire. Power primary plasma lances. Target the center of their formation. Burn the flagship to ash. Let the rest watch their leader evaporate." On the Archimedes, the threat warning receiver screamed a high-pitched, agonizing tone. "Massive energy spikes detected from the supercarriers," Rogers reported, panic finally bleeding into her professional composure. "Admiral, they are locking primary plasma lances. We cannot tank those hits with a blade of armor. A single strike will vaporize us instantly." 60 seconds, Admiral," Coleman screamed over the comms. "Just hold them off for 60 seconds. Coleman looked around his bridge. The crew was exhausted, battered, and staring death in the face. He looked at the tactical map. 9 human ships had already been reduced to drifting scrap. The remaining 50 were heavily damaged, their armor pitted and scorched. They had fought a brilliant, brutal knife fight, but knives were useless against the firing squad. Divert all remaining auxiliary power from life support, artificial gravity, and internal lighting, Coleman commanded. Route everything into the thrusters. "We aren't going to sit here and wait to be executed." "Sir?" Rogers asked, confusion momentarily overriding her fear. "If we can't block their fire, we make sure they can't shoot without hitting their own," Coleman said, a dangerous fire igniting in his eyes. Helm set a collision course for the Vraxis dreadnought formation. Full military thrust. "We are taking this fight to point-blank range." Gravity on the Archimedes failed instantly as the power grid rerouted to the massive fusion drives at the ship's stern. The bridge crew was suddenly weightless, held to their stations only by their multi-point crash harnesses. Emergency red lighting bathed the command deck in a sinister, bloody glow. Outside, the remaining 50 human ships mirrored the flagship's desperate maneuver. Their main thrusters flared with blinding, white-hot intensity as they accelerated directly toward the overwhelming Vraxis armada. "Admiral, we are approaching terminal combat velocity." Commander C. Need Rogers called out, her fingers dancing awkwardly across the haptic keyboard without the aid of gravity. "Estimated time until we intercept their frontline dreadnoughts is 30 seconds. The supercarriers are struggling to track our new trajectory, but their plasma lances are almost fully charged. Keep the fleet tight," Admiral Trevor Coleman ordered, his voice echoing in the eerie, low-humming silence of the zero-gravity bridge. "We wedge ourselves between their heavy dreadnoughts. Force the supercarriers to fire through their own ships to get to us." Aboard the hegemony flagship Obsidian Blade, Commander Ziller watched the tactical display with mounting disbelief. The human fleet was not attempting evasive maneuvers. They were charging straight into the teeth of the Vraxis formation. "High Commander," the Vraxis sub-commander stammered, his pale green scales flushing with anxiety. "The human trajectory. They are attempting to embed themselves within our primary battle group. If we fire the plasma lances now, the dispersion bloom will incinerate our own dreadnoughts." Ziller slammed his armored fist against the bulkhead, denting the reinforced alloy. "Madness. Absolute madness. They are suicidal. Order the dreadnoughts to brace for impact. Let the humans shatter themselves against our shields. In the void of space, the human cruisers and destroyers threaded the needle. Traveling at terrifying speeds, they plunged directly into the heart of the Vraxian formation. The sheer mass and velocity of the human ships triggered the proximity alarms across the alien fleet. Vraxian dreadnoughts desperately fired their maneuvering thrusters, trying to avoid the incoming kinetic missiles that were the human vessels. "We are inside their formation, sir," Lieutenant David Carter shouted, monitoring the proximity sensors. Vraxian warships loomed massive and menacing in the viewports, so close that the crew of the Archimedes could see the intricate geometric patterns of the alien hull plating. Dr. Coleman keyed his headset. "Charge status on the glasshouse arrays?" 95%, Admiral. Aeneas Collins replied, his voice a frantic pitch. "But, sir, we are completely surrounded by their fleet. If we activate the null point fields now, the gravitational distortion will latch onto the mass of their dreadnoughts. It won't just absorb energy. It will try to pull their ships into the singularities. That," Coleman said, a grim smile finally breaking his stoic facade, "is precisely the point, Doctor. Prepare to engage the I-rays." Coleman switched back to the fleet-wide channel. "All ships, this is actual. You are currently nestled tightly against Vraxian capital ships. On my mark, you will engage the glasshouse arrays, but you will not set them to absorb. You will set them to expand. We are going to weaponize the vacuum." Rogers gasped, her eyes widening as she realized the sheer audacity of the plan. The null-point projectors were designed to fold space-time inward, creating a defensive pocket. But if the polarity was reversed and the field was expanded outward, the intense gravitational shear would violently warp the space around them. Against energy shields and solid armor, it would act like a cosmic tidal wave, ripping atoms apart. "Admiral, the supercarriers are repositioning," Rogers warned, tracking the massive red icons on the edge of the display. "They are locking their plasma lances on our coordinates, disregarding the safety of their own dreadnoughts. Xyler is willing to sacrifice his own ships to kill us." "Let him try," Coleman said coldly. "Collins, execute the null-point expansion. God help us." Collins whispered over the comms, engaging expansion protocols. Deep within the human fleet, the experimental Lockheed Martin hardware screamed as it was pushed beyond every theoretical safety limit. The supercapacitors discharged their massive payloads of exotic energy simultaneously. Space didn't just distort this time, it violently fractured. Around each of the 50 human ships, massive waves of gravitational force erupted outward in invisible rippling spheres. These weren't the tight, defensive funnels they had used before. These were uncontrolled, expanding spatial anomalies. The sheer gravitational shear hit the surrounding Vraxis dreadnoughts with the force of a localized black hole. The Gear-Axis energy shields, designed to deflect light and heat, were utterly useless against a weapon that simply bent the space the ships occupied. On the view screens, the horrific majesty of the human weapon was unleashed. Vraxis dreadnoughts, massive engines of war, literally bent in half. Their titanium composite hulls groaned and shrieked as the immense gravitational tides pulled their bow and stern in opposite directions. Armor plating shattered like brittle plastic. Internal plasma reactors breached their containment fields, violently venting superheated gas into the void. Within seconds, over 40 Varax-Is dreadnoughts were torn to shreds by the sheer gravitational stress of the expanding null-point fields. The space around the human fleet was instantly filled with a chaotic maelstrom of twisting metal, escaping atmosphere and detonating alien warships. But the human ships were not immune to the chaos. The strain of projecting the outward gravitational waves took a brutal toll on the unshielded vessels. The Dauntless, already heavily damaged from the kinetic barrage, suffered a catastrophic feedback loop in its glasshouse array. The expanding field suddenly collapsed inward, instantly crushing the cruiser into a ball of super-dense scrap metal, no larger than a transport shuttle. "We've lost the Dauntless, the Endeavor, and the Vanguard," Carter yelled, the bridge shaking so violently that several crew members were thrown against their restraints. "The expanding fields are causing microfractures across our own hull. We can't maintain this output, Admiral." "Shut down the arrays," Coleman ordered, gripping his console as a massive piece of Vraxis debris slammed against the Archimedes' primary viewport, spider-webbing the reinforced glass. The gravitational anomalies collapsed as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving the human fleet drifting in a graveyard of pulverized Vraxis warships. The hegemony formation was entirely shattered, their dreadnoughts reduced to spinning wreckage. "Damage report," Coleman commanded, breathing heavily as emergency gravity was restored to the bridge, slamming the crew back into their seats. "We are down to 46 ships," Admiral Rogers reported, her voice trembling but resolute. "The remaining glasshouse arrays are completely fried. The supercapacitors are melted to slag. We have no defensive capabilities, and our primary conventional weapons are practically out of ammunition." Coleman looked out the cracked viewport at the devastation they had wrought. They had destroyed nearly half of the Vraxis armada. They had done the impossible. But the tactical display still showed a terrifying truth. The Vraxis supercarriers, 24 of them, had survived the gravitational storm by staying on the outer edge of the formation. And now the plasma lances on the colossal ships glowed with blinding, annihilating light. "They have an unobstructed line of sight," Rogers whispered, "and we have nothing left to throw at them." Commander Ziller's face appeared on the main viewer once more, overriding the secure communications channels. His ceremonial armor was scorched, his golden eyes burning with a mixture of raw fury and undeniable terror. He had vastly underestimated humanity, and it had cost him his vanguard and his heavy dreadnoughts. "You fight with the savagery of beasts," Ziller spat, the translation matrix struggling to process his guttural rage. "You employ forbidden physics. You sacrifice your own to inflict pain. But your tricks are exhausted. Your anomalous weapons are broken. I will not ask for your surrender again. I will erase you from the stars." The screen went black as the Vraxis supercarriers finalized their firing sequences. "Admiral," Rogers looked at Coleman, tears finally welling in her eyes. "It's been an honor." Trevor Coleman looked at his crew, then at the massive glowing plasma lances of the supercarriers. He had pushed his people to the absolute breaking point. They had defied the hegemony, broken their fleet, and proven that Earth would not go quietly into the dark. Dr. Collins, Coleman said, his voice completely calm. Reroute everything into the slip space drives. I mean everything. The life support, the weapons, the main reactor. Admiral, Collins sounded completely bewildered. We are still inside their gravity interdiction net. If we spool the slip drives while trapped in a gravity well, the engines will detonate. We'll tear a hole in real space and take half the sector with us. Exactly, Coleman said. Spin them up? The command deck of the Archimedes was bathed in the harsh, strobing glare of emergency crimson lighting. Sparks rained down like agonizing fireworks from shattered overhead conduits, and the air was thick with the suffocating stench of melted insulation and ozone. Admiral Trevor Coleman stood completely still amidst the chaos, his hands clasped behind his back, projecting an aura of terrifying calm that anchored the terrified bridge crew. Deep in the engineering bay, Dr. Aeneas Collins stared at the primary diagnostic console, his hand shaking violently over the greasy keyboard. He was a physicist, not a soldier, and what the Admiral was ordering went against every fundamental law of hyperdimensional mechanics taught at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Admiral, Collins' voice cracked over the ship-wide comms, barely audible over the roaring, unstable hum of the massive General Electric fusion cores. You are asking me to intentionally induce a slip-space cascade. The Vraxis gravity interdiction net acts as a localized anchor in real space. If we try to punch a hole into the slipstream while that net is active, the resulting spatial friction won't just destroy our ships. It will rip the fabric of space-time in this entire sector to shreds. It's not a jump, sir. It's a multi-megaton spatial bomb. I am aware of the physics, Aeneas, Coleman replied, his snorts voice an icy monolith of resolve. The Vraxer supercarriers are generating that interdiction net. They are tethering us to this system using concentrated gravitational beams. If we spool the drives and attempt a jump, where does the physical feedback loop go? Silence hung on the line for a fraction of a second as Collins mentally ran the calculations. Then a sharp, ragged gasp echoed through the comms. The feedback loop, Collins whispered, all bleeding through his terror. It will travel straight up their own gravity tethers. It will hit their projection engines like a hyperdimensional lightning strike. But, Admiral, the shock wave of real space tearing apart will still catch us. Our ablative armor is gone. We don't have the shielding to ride out a spatial rupture. We don't need to ride it out, Coleman said, stepping forward to the tactical holotable. His eyes locked on the terrifying red icons of the 24 Vraxer supercarriers. We just need to initiate the jump and let the mathematics do the rest. Sync the fleet's navigational computers. SpaceX algorithmic overrides. Authorization code Omega 0 actual. Spool the drives, Doctor. That is a direct order. Aye, Admiral. Spooling the slip-space drives. Make God have mercy on us. Across the battered, bleeding formation of the 46 surviving human ships, the massive slip-space engines began to hum. These were not the elegant silent drives of the Viraxis. These were brutal primitive Pratt and Whitney, hyperdrives designed to forcefully rip a hole in the universe and shove a ship through it. As the drives began to draw gargantuan amounts of power from the ship's fusion reactors, the space around the human fleet began to vibrate. It was a violent, sickening oscillation, visible to the naked eye as the starlight around them began to strobe and tear. Aboard the Viraxis Hegemony flagship Obsidian Blade, Commander Xyler stood triumphantly on his elevated command dais. His golden eyes were fixed on the tactical projection, eagerly awaiting the glorious annihilation of the human fleet. The primary plasma lances of his 24 supercarriers were fully charged. Snorts, greater than humming with the contained energy of miniature suns. Targeting locks confirmed, High Commander. The sub-commander stated, his clawed hands hovering over the execution sequence. The human vessels have ceased all evasive thruster burns. They are entirely stationary. Firing on your command. Xyler opened his mandibles in a vicious smile. Let the galaxy bear witness. This is what becomes of defiance. Fire the weight. The sub-commander suddenly shrieked, his pale green scales turning an ashen gray. He slammed his fists onto his sensor terminal, desperately trying to parse the sudden flood of anomalous data. High Commander, we are reading catastrophic energy spikes within the human formation. Their fusion reactors are redlining. A final, pathetic attempt to overload their weapons. Xyler scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. It matters not. The lances will vaporize them before they can fire. No, sir. It is not their weapon systems. The sub-commander spun around, his pupilless eyes wide with absolute primal horror. It is their slipspace drives. They are initiating a hyper-dimensional jump. The bridge of the Obsidian Blade fell deadly silent. Xyler's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, creeping dread that he had never felt in his centuries of command. Impossible. Xyler whispered. They cannot jump. Our interdiction net locks this sector's gravity. A jump sequence will fail. It will simply crush their vessels. They are not trying to jump away, High Commander, the sub-commander screamed. The discipline of the hegemony military entirely breaking down. They are using the drives to weaponize the net. The spatial friction is building. The humans are intentionally creating a slipspace cascade. If they breach the dimensional wall while our tethers are active, the feedback loop will travel back to our projection engines. It will ignite the vacuum. Xyler stared at the holographic representation of the human fleet. The red icons of the human ships were no longer just targets. They were glowing with the blinding white intensity of a spatial rupture in progress. The humans weren't trying to escape. They were playing a game of cosmic chicken. They are insane. Xyler breathed, taking a staggering step back from his console. They would annihilate themselves just to break our fleet. They are a plague of madness. High Commander, the lances are primed. The weapons officer shouted. Do we fire? If we fire, the thermal bloom will destabilize their reactors and trigger the cascade instantly. Xyler roared, panic finally shattering his composure. Cut the power to the plasma lances. Drop the interdiction net. Disengage the gravity tethers immediately. Dropping the net requires a full minute for the projection engines to safely power down. The sub-commander cried out. If we sever the tethers instantly, the recoil will do it. Xyler commanded, his voice echoing with absolute desperation. Sever the tethers. Let them jump into the void. Just get that madness away from my ships. Admiral, the Vraxis plasma lances are powering down. Commander Sneed Rogers shouted over the deafening, bone-rattling vibration of the Archimedes. Sensor telemetry shows massive fluctuations in their interdiction net. Zyler is panicking. He's cutting the gravity tethers. A vicious, predatory smile finally broke across Trevor Coleman's face. He had banked everything on the Vraxis commander's sense of self-preservation. The aliens viewed humanity as a primitive, logical species fighting a losing war. They could never comprehend the sheer, spiteful audacity of mutually assured destruction. "He's too late," Coleman said softly. Then his voice boomed across the command deck. "Collins, do not abort. Push the drives past the red line. Force the rupture. Drives are at 120%. Collins screamed back from engineering, the sound of tearing metal audible over the comms. "The interdiction net is dropping, but the tethers are still connected to their supercarriers. We are breaching the dimensional wall now." Outside the shattered viewport of the Archimedes, reality gave way. There was no sound, only a blinding, multichromatic flash of impossible colors as 46 human vessels violently punctured the fabric of real space. Because the Vraxis interdiction net was in the frantic process of shutting down, it was unstable. As the human slip-space drives tore the hole in the universe, the immense gravitational friction caught the receding Vraxis tethers. Like a cosmic whip cracking across the dark expanse of the Ross 128 system, the hyperdimensional feedback loop snapped back along the invisible gravity beams. Aboard the Obsidian Blade, Commander Ziller only had time to watch the main view screen turn a blinding, brilliant purple. The feedback loop slammed into the 24 Vraxis supercarriers with the force of a supernova. The massive, city-sized alien vessels, heavily armored and shielded against conventional weaponry, were utterly defenseless against a localized tear in spacetime. The spatial anomalies hit their massive interdiction projection engines. The supercarriers did not merely explode. They were conceptually unmade. Massive chunks of the alien warships were violently pulled into the localized slip-space tiers. Snorts, greater than while other sections were crushed into microscopic singularities. The Obsidian Blade buckled, its titanium alloy spine snapping in a dozen places before its primary plasma reactors overloaded. A chain reaction of catastrophic detonations ripped through the Vraxis fleet. The 24 unstoppable juggernauts of the hegemony, the pride of the alien armada, were reduced to expanding clouds of superheated glowing dust in a matter of seconds. Simultaneously, the 46 human ships were violently sucked into the chaotic, tearing vortex of the slip-space tunnel they had created. The transition was brutal. Without their electromagnetic shields to smooth the hyperdimensional slipstream, the human ships were violently thrown around the chaotic tunnel of warped space. Base Systems' automated damage control networks desperately sealed hull breaches as the fierce dimensional winds ripped entire sensor arrays and armor plates from the ship's exteriors. On the bridge of the Archimedes, the crew was thrown violently against their crash harnesses. Consoles short-circuited in showers of sparks, and the deafening roar of the dimensional transit threatened to shatter their eardrums. Coleman gripped the edge of his command console, his knuckles white, his jaw set. He watched a chaotic swirl of purple and black energy out the cracked viewport, silently willing his battered ship to hold together just a little longer. "Navigational algorithms are failing," Rogers yelled, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. "The SpaceX guidance matrix is struggling to map a stable exit vector. We are skipping across the dimensional barrier." Lock on to the Alpha Centauri beacon, Coleman ordered, fighting to keep his voice steady against the violent shaking. Dump all remaining auxiliary power to the structural integrity fields. We hold together. We do not die in the dark. For 3 agonizing endless minutes, the human fleet rode the chaotic lightning of the fractured slipstream. They were battered, burning, and bleeding, riding a shock wave of their own creation. And then, as violently as it had begun, it ended. With a massive concussive jolt, the Archimedes and the surviving human fleet were spat back out into real space. The violent purple vortex collapsed behind them, sealing the tier and leaving them drifting in the cold, silent void. The bridge of the flagship was eerily quiet. The emergency lights flickered, casting long bruised shadows across the command deck. The only sounds were the hiss of localized oxygen fires and the ragged, exhausted breathing of the crew. "Status," Coleman croaked, his voice raw. Commander Rogers wiped the blood from her eyes and looked down at her battered terminal. It took several seconds for the system to reboot and paint the tactical map. We are at the rally point," Admiral Rogers whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of shock and profound relief. "Alpha Centauri system, we made it." "The fleet?" Coleman asked, his heart pounding against his ribs. "Reading 42 active transponders, sir," Rogers reported softly. "We lost 4 in the slipstream transit. The Valkyrie, the Corsair, the Ironclad, and the Ares. They didn't make it out. The surviving ships are heavily damaged. Most are running on reserve battery power. But they are alive." Coleman closed his eyes for a brief moment, mourning the names of the lost ships. They had paid the ultimate price, but they had bought humanity a victory that the galaxy would never forget. "And the Vraxis?" Coleman asked, opening his eyes and looking at the main viewer. "Long-range sensors are painting Ross 128. Lieutenant Carter spoke up from his station, all lacing his exhausted voice. "Admiral, there is nothing left. The Vraxis supercarriers are completely gone. The spatial rupture wiped out their entire remaining armada. The sector is littered with their debris. Commander Ziller and the First Hegemony Armada have been annihilated." A collective shuddering breath was released across the bridge. No one cheered. Across the bridge. No one cheered. They were too broken, too tired, too close to the edge of the abyss. But as they looked at the tactical map, at the glowing yellow sun of Alpha Centauri, and the 42 battered human ships holding their formation, a profound sense of pride settled over the crew. The Vraxis hegemony had demanded their surrender. They had brought 400 heavily armed warships to crush 60 unshielded primitive human vessels. They had expected fear. They had expected submission. Instead, they learned a terrifying truth about humanity. When cornered, when stripped of their shields and their safety, humans did not surrender. They bent the laws of physics. They weaponized the void. And they burned their enemies to ash. Admiral Trevor Coleman straightened his uniform, wiping a smudge of soot from his lapel. He looked out the cracked viewport at the distant shining light of Earth's nearest neighbor. "Open a fleet-wide channel," Coleman said, his voice calm, resolute, and filled with the quiet strength of a species that had just conquered the impossible. "Channel open, Admiral. All vessels, this is actual," Coleman broadcasted, his words carrying across the 42 surviving ships of Task Force 7. "Stand down from combat alert. Initiate automated repair protocols and signal the Alpha Centauri defense grid for medical and logistical support. We are going home." He paused, a faint smile touching his battle-weary face. Let the hegemony core worlds hear the silence of Ross 128. Let them know what happens when they demand our surrender. Excellent work, ladies and gentlemen. Coleman out. If you were on the edge of your seat during this epic tale of human resilience and tactical brilliance, make sure to hit that like button. We are dedicated to bringing you the most thrilling, heart-pounding sci-fi stories where humanity proves its absolute indomitable spirit against impossible odds. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow sci-fi enthusiasts and subscribe to our channel for more amazing HFY lore, epic battles, and dramatic storytelling. Your support helps us create more incredible adventures across the stars. Join our fleet today. Leave a comment below and never surrender.